Morning, everyone. We're just going to give people a couple minutes to trickle in, and we'll get started in just a minute here. All right, I think we're good to get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Business Support Series webinar. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Emma Minchevsky. I'm the Communications Manager here at the Halifax Chamber, and I'm your host for today. I have to admit, this is a topic I don't know much about, so I'm really looking forward to learning more from Dallas. The Chamber represents over 1,700 businesses, and through those businesses, we represent more than 60,000 employees in Halifax. So it's very important for employers and employees alike to learn about the benefits and the costs of workers' compensation and how it actually works in Nova Scotia. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions for our presenter. When we get to the Q&A at the end, feel free to type any other questions you might have into the chat box. Our presenter and guest speaker today is Dallas Mercer, founder of Dallas Mercer Consulting. In 2002, Dallas founded Dallas Mercer Consulting, also known as DMC, offering disability management services. As an employer advocate, she added efficiency to sick leave and workers' compensation claims processes, saving clients time and money, allowing them to focus on their core business. DMC has expanded to offer safety training, safety consulting, and industrial hygiene services to over 550 clients across Canada. Welcome, Dallas, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today for a little chat about workers' compensation, and I guess the topic is what you don't know will cost you. So the plan today is to just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about workers' comp and heighten your sensitivity as to things you should be aware of. I mean, it's a really short seminar. Obviously, I got an ambitious agenda, but the goal today is really to heighten your sensitivity around things you should be paying attention to. So as Emma mentioned, DMC was founded in 2002. We have offices in Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, and in Nova Scotia. And we currently have over 550 employers across Canada that we work with, and they consist of union, multi-union, and non-union experience. So we manage workers' compensation and sick leave for companies. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nova Scotia system. I'm going to talk a little bit about rate setting and experience rating, a little bit about understanding your role as an employer, but also giving you a little bit of information about what other roles are as well for the stakeholders in the system. We'll talk a little bit about the reporting structure, return to work, objections and appeals, and then I'm just going to give you some stats, which you may or may not be aware of. So first of all, how the system works, the fundamentals of the workers' compensation system. So William Meredith, who was from Ontario many years ago, founded the principles for the workers' compensation systems that are not just for Nova Scotia, but all the workers' compensation systems across Canada. So the first one is no fault insurance. So it doesn't matter whose fault it is, the worker or the employer, the worker is entitled to benefits. So just a little quick example on that. If you have a requirement within your workplace that the worker has to wear steel-toe shoes, and they don't have their steel-toe shoes on, and something falls on their foot and they break their toe or they break their foot, they're still entitled to benefits. You obviously can take disciplinary action for somebody who didn't follow, the protocols or rules within the company, but it doesn't bar a worker's right to compensation. So it's a no-fault insurance system. There's also collective liability, so everybody pays, kind of like the same premise as your car insurance. Everybody pays into the system, so there is a collective liability. There is security of payment for the worker, so whether or not an employer is negligent on making their payments, the worker is still going to receive their payment. Exclusive jurisdiction just means that workers' compensation has the right to interpret the legislation and make the policies and execute the system. Rarely do issues end up in a court process. There are internal appeals processes built into the system, but they have the right to manage the workers' compensation system. There's also an independent board, so there's a board of directors that govern the system, and those are generally made up of some employer representatives, worker representatives, some members at large. So that's typically how the workers' compensation systems in Canada are governed from a principal perspective. In Nova Scotia, there's around 19,000 employers, covering 339, that's supposed to be 1,000 workers. In 2019, there were 24,900 new claims, and those obviously are made up of some lost time, some no lost time, and some were either not pursued or were disallowed. The largest sector employers, so the ones who contribute most to the system, are healthcare, social services, retail, and manufacturing. So when you think about the premiums you pay to workers' compensation, what do they cover? So they cover all the benefits that a worker is entitled to, the occupational health and safety, administrative services of workers, occupational health and safety, the salaries and operational costs of all the staff at workers' comp, health and safety research fund, and the review division as well, which is called WCAT. Sorry, that's a typo. It's the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal in Nova Scotia. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can start to put them in the question box. We're going to answer all the questions at the end, because what I find a lot of times in doing the workshop is people ask questions that I'm going to cover in a little bit. So if at the end it's still a question, you can certainly put it in and I will do my best to answer it. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the rate system. So the rate system is based on an industrial classification system. So there's an industry-based rate. Whether or not your particular industry has a levy, then a levy would be added. And then there's an experience rate, depending on how you're doing compared to your peers, which would give you your net rate or the rate that you're paying. You're charged per $100 of assessable payroll, and as of 2021, the ceiling is $64,500 per employee. So that's what your assessments are based on. So if you have employees making $80,000, you only pay up to $64,500 because that's what their pay will be based on. So, workers' comp in Nova Scotia collects levies on behalf of employers in several industries that fund industry-based safety associations. And if you're an employer who's not in one of those industry associations, then you are not charged the levy. So the base rate is grouped by industry. So it's an industrial classification, not an occupational classification. So it's based on what you're grouped into an industry based on the similarity of your business activity, your nature of work, your level of risk. So you should be in a group of industries, either your competitors or doing very similar work to you. So these are industry rate groups. Some large industries stand alone if there's not a lot of competitors, and smaller industry groups are combined into rate groups. And it's always a good thing to be combined with other companies in an industry rate group, because that allows for more resilience from the perspective if you do have claims costs. So your industry base rate, each year the assessment must generate enough revenue to cover all the current and future costs associated with that year industry. So for 2021, workers' compensation has to collect enough money to pay for all the claims that happen in 2021. So a claim could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 months, it could be 5 years, it could be 20 years. So they use actuarial studies to determine what percentage of claims will cost what amount. So they need to collect enough money to pay for all the current and future costs. If there's an unfunded liability, which obviously in Nova Scotia there is an unfunded liability, then they also need to try to collect enough money so that they can start to be fully funded. And Nova Scotia is succeeding on their trek to be fully funded. They're the only province right now in Canada that is not fully funded. So unfortunately, the rates need to include a cushion to be able to allow them to collect money for those future, for the unfunded liability. They also need to make sure they collect enough money for the expenditures for the safety and preventative programs, their administrative funding within the workers' compensation system, and as I stated with previously, all funding deficiencies from previous years. So, they're trying to collect enough money so that they can get to be fully funded. Base rate influencers. So when you think about what could possibly influence the rate, why could there be a fluctuation in the rate? So it could be the cost of services. So when you think about the cost of medical care or if people need to have diagnostic testing and they need to travel in order to have diagnostic testing, or if there's a wait for diagnostic testing, and whatever the services are that a worker would require. Financial obligations, which we talked about, of the Workers' Compensation Commission. The economic environment. Has there been a big downturn in the economy, or is there a lot happening in the economy right now? So that would have an impact. Are there more employers moving into the province? Certainly from the perspective of COVID, where, it'll take us a little while to see how that's impacted the workers' compensation system. Also, adjudication policies. So what is workers' compensation accepting or not accepting? Are there new medical conditions that are now being accepted? For example, the presumption legislation for PTSD, post-traumatic stress. Now that most provinces in Canada have presumption legislation for PTSD, people in certain occupations, will that now have an impact? Will there be more claims? So if there's more claims in that area, then workers' compensation needs to take into consideration that they will need to collect more money for that. Also, accident and injury trends. Are we seeing more accidents or incidents in certain industries? Or do we have an aging population where it's taking people longer to recover from certain types of injuries or illnesses that are covered under the Act? So these are all the kinds of things that need to be taken into consideration that can have an influence on what the rates are. And the rates are set every year, as you know. So when you think about the 2020 industry rate, the years that are taken into consideration is 2014 to 2018, and 2019 is the lag year. So the year you are in, so for example, right now we're in 2020, 2020 is not taken into consideration when they're setting the base rate, because we're not finished this year, and obviously the rates are out now, so you couldn't consider this year. So this is kind of what's called the lag year. So that's why sometimes it seems like it takes a long time for claims costs, your experience if you've had a really expensive claim, it seems like it takes a long time for that to fall off because of the lag year, because there's a year where you actually don't see it, and then you don't see it till the following year, and then it takes 3 years for that experience. So that's why that happens. Every province does not have this kind of a system, but most provinces do have the experience rating system. So these are just some examples of industry base rates, and obviously you can find these on the Workers' Compensation website in the 2021 rate book, but it just gives you an idea. So, Nova Scotia industry rates includes the levy, and this is over a 3-year period. So this is just some examples of rates. I mean, obviously trucking is a really high rate, $6.46. Homes for personal and nursing care are at $6. Auto repairs, $3.40. Sawmills, $6.91. Ambulance services, $7.87. So this is just some examples of how the rates have been progressing. Most of them, they have been increasing. There's been some minimal reductions in some, however, some industries. So generally, employers are not assigned multiple classifications. So typically, if you you have one industry rate, you can, however, have multiple classifications if you can demonstrate that the operations are not supportive of each other. So, for example, if you have a gas station and a garage and they can operate independently, then you might be able to ask for multiple classifications. Typically, that's not how it works. Typically, it's an industrial classification, but you would need to demonstrate that. So, if you do have concerns about that, I'd certainly be happy to work through that with you. But for the most part, you have one classification. So what you need to remember is the performance of the group affects everyone in the industry. So even though you might be competitors in your industry, it's really important to share experiences as it relates to how you're managing your workers' compensation claims, or how you're from a safety perspective as well. Just to give you an example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, back in 2004, I started working with one of the larger seafood processors in Newfoundland and Labrador, and their base rate was $6.14. So combined with experience, some of them were paying $8 or $9 for every $100 of payroll. So even though they were fierce competitors, they decided to work together. So they brought me into the association meeting where I started to work with all of the big players in the fish processing industry. And what an impact we had over many years. And you can see that the rate is now $2.61. And actually, I think the rates are out today or tomorrow in Newfoundland and Labrador, so we'll be able to see where it stands now. But as you can see, working together, even though you're competitors, working together as an industry, to try to put processes and protocols and share best practices can have a huge impact. And everybody wins when you think of putting those kinds of processes in place and working together within your industry. It can have an impact on everybody for the better. I mean, in this particular case, that's right off the bottom line, a reduction in what they were paying to workers' compensation. So that's the base rate. So next we'll talk a little bit about the experience rating model. So the experience rating model is designed to build equity and accountability. So there's merits and demerits based on your claims cost experience. So this is where it gets more individualized. So it's really, trying to introduce some accountability within the model. So everybody shares what the base rate is, but your experience is really more individualized. So it introduces individual assessment rates for participating employers. So it's determined by comparing your claims costs relative to your payroll to your industry's average claims cost. So, and the participation is reflected by, obviously your company size and what your assessment premiums are. So depending whether you're large or small will determine your role within the experience rating model. It's based on 3 years. Again, there's a lag year. So for 2020, it's your claims cost experience for 2016, 2017, and 2018. So even though it goes back 4 years, including the year you're in, it's really 3 years of claims costs that are included in your experience rating. So your claims costs are compared to how your industry is doing. So depending on whether or not you have a surcharge will determine whether or not, depending on whether or not you're above or below your peers will determine whether or not you have to pay an experience surcharge. So, that's why if you're working as an industry and everybody's working together and you lower the base rate, then everybody wins. Everybody wins from the perspective of then, even if you do have some experience, it would be, if the base rate is lower, it doesn't have such a dramatic impact. There's also a surcharge program, and the surcharge program targets employers whose claims costs are at least 200% higher than their rate group, at least 4 consecutive experience statements. So you will get a notice, and in Nova Scotia, this is made public. So your first year that you are over would start at a 20%, and it increases to 40 and 60 and so on until you are no longer 200% higher than the average. So they will give you warnings to let you know that you are moving into a surcharge position. And of course, if you are a company who has experienced that surcharge for being 200% higher than your rate group for 4 years, then there's safety processes and protocols you can put in place to actually get a rebate on the amount of money that you're charged. So experience rating adjustments provide an incentive. So what they're trying to do is use the experience rating incentive as a ways and means to get you to create a safer working environment. So let's just move into, now that we've talked a little bit about the base rate and the experience rate, let's just talk a little bit now about understanding what your role is as an employer. The workers' compensation system is funded 100% by the employers in the province. So you need to know your role and you need to really actively participate. So once an injury occurs, you need to know the roles and responsibilities of all the workplace parties, offering solutions to mitigate barriers for return to work, and objecting when appropriate to participate in the appeals process. So what's workers' comp's role? So workers' compensation's role is to provide clear information in a timely manner. They're supposed to work with the employee and the employer to prevent and develop effective disability management services in helping get the workers back to work, provide effective compensation and rehab services, and they're also obviously supposed to maintain sound financial and administrative management practices. The employer's role, obviously you have to pay your assessments. You need to report all work-related injuries and illnesses. contact the injured worker as soon as possible after an injury occurs, and help injured workers return to work and obviously provide suitable employment. So as an employer, that's your role. The worker's role. And, I think often people don't realize that the worker does have a role to actively participate in the workers' compensation system. And I think it's important for employers to understand that role, but also to make sure that that is communicated to workers that you have on claim. So they are to fully participate in the rehabilitation plan that hopefully helps them recover. They're also required to maintain regular contact with the employer, with workers' comp, and with their healthcare providers. If they have appointments, then they need to attend those appointments. They also need to contact their employer as soon as possible after an injury occurs. And if an employer offers suitable work in accordance with their functional abilities, then the worker has an obligation to accept that work. And the healthcare provider. They're supposed to support, obviously, in the recovery and the return to work by providing the injured worker and the employer by working with all stakeholders, the injured worker and the employer and healthcare providers, and send reports to workers' comp, and also provide information on those reports that allows the employer to determine if they can safely accommodate that worker. If you are in a unionized setting, then the union's role is to assist the accident employer in helping to identify suitable employment and supporting any reasonable accommodation that is being offered in the workplace. So those, if you just think in generalities, are the roles. So now if we look at the first step in the workers' compensation system, really the first step of contact that an employer has with workers' comp is filling out the injury report. So the accident report or the injury report is what is completed to notify workers' compensation that something has happened on your workplace. So we're going to talk a little bit about who completes it, when to do it, and some best practices in completing the form. This form is probably, in a lot of cases, not given the attention that it really deserves. So the purpose of the report, is to notify workers' comp that there's been an accident, and under the Workers' Compensation Act, you are required to do that. So it's kind of like the application. So it's the worker's application for benefits, or to notify workers' comp of an accident, but it's an employer's report. So it acts as a dual role in Nova Scotia. Not every province has a form that you complete together. New Brunswick had a report that it was a joint report that was completed, and just recently, in the last couple of months, they've now separated that. So the employer completes a report and the worker completes a report. Same in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's two reports, a worker report and an employer report, but in Nova Scotia, they're still maintaining a joint report. So we'll talk a little bit about the benefits that a worker could possibly receive from workers' compensation. So first, there's temporary earnings benefit replacement. So that is paid to a worker. There's obviously 2 days waiting period, but this is paid to a worker. So a worker gets 75% of their earnings for the first 26 weeks, and after 26 weeks, they get 85% of their benefit. Extended earnings replacement benefit, or EERB, that can be paid to a worker in one of a couple of ways. It can be paid if a worker is not able to work and it's been determined that they have a permanent disability and they're not able to work. It can also be paid if a worker returns to work and they're not able to earn equivalent to their pre-injury earnings. A worker can also, if a worker has a permanent medical impairment, then a worker can also have a permanent impairment benefit, or a PIB. If it's determined it's less than 30% and you've returned to work, it will be paid as a lump sum. But if it's determined that you have a loss of earnings, or if it's greater than 30%, then it's a monthly benefit that you would receive for life. There's also survivor benefits. So if a worker dies as a result of a workplace accident, the surviving spouse will receive the deceased worker's entitlement until the deceased worker would have turned 65, or the surviving spouse, whichever is later. There's also an annuity, so 5% of your benefits are put aside. So if you are in receipt of extended earnings replacement benefits, and there's a PIB, a permanent impairment benefit, then you can receive an annuity after you turn age 65. And what it's meant to do is replace your loss of a retirement pension. There is also in Nova Scotia a pain-related impairment. So if you have a chronic condition or chronic pain, then there can be an assessment to determine if you are entitled to that kind of a benefit. So we talked about the injury report. So the employer and the injured worker are to jointly report in Nova Scotia. It's important that the employer representative is a person of authority within the company. As I stated previously, a lot of times this report is not given the attention it needs, and it can be filled out prematurely or filled out by someone in the company who doesn't have the authority to do that. And what you need to remember is this is the report that starts everything, and also this is the report that stays with the claim for the life of the claim. You know, often people refer back to say what was on the injury report, you know, because it might seem like the injury seems like it's worsened, or, you know, there could be body parts added to the claim. So you do refer back to this report a lot. It's a very significant form. So it's something that if you don't take this form extremely seriously in your business, if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar today, I would like you to really give this report the attention it deserves and make sure it's completed by someone in the company who has the authority to speak on behalf of the company and does the necessary research and background investigation to make sure that the information presented on that report is an accurate reflection of what happened at the work site. And workers' comp must receive it within 5 days of the injury, or there can be penalties. And, you know, I would suggest if it's going to be late that, you know, or if you've not completed your investigation, or if you need to find more information, then you take the necessary time to do that and notify workers' comp that the report might be late. It would be better to do that than prematurely fill it out to avoid the 5-day penalty, because, you know, you could have the claim for a very long time. And you never know which claim is a claim that might last for a very long time. So, required medical, so that must be sent to workers' comp, and you must advise, you know, if there would require medical attention or if the worker will lose time from work. So that's very important to let them know. There's also serious injury or illness. So Nova Scotia Labour and Advanced Education's Occupational Health and Safety Division must be notified within 24 hours of these particular conditions. So if you have an employee that incurs the loss of consciousness or fracture, amputation, third-degree burn, loss of sight in one or both eyes, an injury that required admission to hospital, an injury that endangers the employee's life, any type of an explosion or exposure to biological, chemical, physical agent, whether or not the person's injured, you still have to notify workers' comp. Any catastrophic event, failure of equipment, or obviously a fatality, then these need to be, you need to notify Department of Labor, Advanced Education as soon as possible. So the best practices when completing the form, obviously, you know, answer them carefully, honestly, don't guess. So, you know, if you don't know exactly how long the worker's been with you, whether it's 10 months or 12 months or 12 months and 5 days or 9 months and 18 days, it's better to be accurate, because these answers can actually have an impact on what kinds of obligations you have from a reemployment obligation perspective. So it's important to make sure that you review and check to make sure. If you are paying the worker, then you need to be clear about that. If you're objecting to the claim, then you need to make sure that you send that information as soon as possible and advise them that you are objecting to the claim. It's workers' compensation's job to adjudicate the claim. You're merely providing information to them. So, you know, if you have conflicting information to the worker, that's okay. It's workers' comp's role to adjudicate and do the necessary investigation. So, but if you are going to object, then it's important that that information is followed with the report. So that's completing the report. You know, and from an adjudication perspective, you know, there's a whole list of things that workers' compensation will review and take into account to determine if an accident arose out of and in the course of employment. So not only did it happen at work, was it caused by work? So those are things that are pretty important. So now we'll talk a little bit about return to work. So, you do have a reemployment obligation, not only under workers' compensation, but under human rights as well. So, so you need to know that it's important to accommodate a worker. And there's two ways when you think about accommodating the worker. There's accommodating the worker for early and safe return to work, which is while a worker is recovering, so that they can recover if it's safe to do so while they're working. And then there's also when a worker medically plateaus or have reached their maximum recovery, and then being able to accommodate them if their job needs to be modified, or if they're not able to return to their previous job, and you accommodating them in a different kind of position. And then there's vocational rehabilitation, when if you cannot accommodate the worker, then workers' compensation will determine whether or not a worker can participate in vocational rehabilitation. That's a really costly option, so I would implore you to really explore every opportunity within your workplace to accommodate your worker, so that they don't have to go down that vocational rehabilitation route. So the workers' compensation policy encourages healthcare providers, the workers, employers, and all the stakeholders to work cooperatively and to explore reasonable and creative, flexible solutions to facilitate early and safe return to work. It's important to remember confidentiality of information is maintained. So depending on who within your organization is working with that employee and managing their claim, that you not share that information when you're planning any type of return to work or rehabilitation activities. So you need to support your injured worker throughout the return to work efforts, promote early and safe return to work as being clinically and vocationally therapeutic. So you need to think of it that you're promoted as you realize the worker is recovering, but they're going to be able to do something for the benefit of the company while they're recovering. You need to recognize that return to work minimizes an injured worker's wage loss, and promote cooperation and active participation of all parties when you're looking at an injured worker's return to work. Injured workers must actively participate in return to work, and there are consequences if they do not participate. So if it's determined that the work you're offering is safe for the worker, then they do have an obligation to participate. It's good to have a structured plan because then that communicates what everybody's role and responsibility is, but it also sets expectations. So returning to productive work within the workers' compensation system is promoted. So I can't talk enough, like just to go back to return to work, about how critical it is to make sure you have a return to work process and don't wait till you have an injury. Planning ahead is a really valuable exercise. I know for our clients, we certainly try to have a policy around return to work and have whatever forms we need for workers to take to doctors, and you have all that in place ahead of time. And workers are well aware that if they are injured on the work site, that the employer is going to do everything possible to accommodate them. And next, of course, is objections and appeals. And this is, what happens when you're not happy as an employer or you're dissatisfied with a decision or a service. So you do have the right to appeal. And the way the system is designed is that you can contact the person who made the decision and get an explanation, or if you need to provide clarification. If you're obviously not happy with that particular objection, then you can ask for an appeal. So request a notice for appeal to a hearings officer. This is an internal process within the workers' compensation system. So it's an opportunity then for the Workers' Compensation Commission to review the decision that they made. It can be a paper review, or they could hold a hearing if they choose to do so. So that's an internal review process. And then if you're still not satisfied, you can go to an external appeals process, which is the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal. And that's an external body to the Workers' Compensation Commission. So an employer can appeal a claim or any type of a decision concerning your assessments or your classification. And as I just stated, there are 2 levels of appeal. So in order to access the external, so it's a tiered process. You need to go through the internal process first. It's always good to make sure that you've given them all the information. It's always good for the original decision maker to make sure they have all the information. But during the internal review process, if you want to, you can submit extra information to the hearings officer. You have 30 days to advise of your appeal. So you have 30 days to appeal a decision. You know, and then if you're dissatisfied with the decision, they usually render a decision within 60 days. And then if you're dissatisfied, you can still appeal to the external appeals process. Again, you have 30 days, and the tribunal operates at arm's length from the workers' compensation system. It's still paid for by the workers' compensation system, but it does operate outside of the workers' compensation system. So the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal will consider the appeal at a hearing. It may be either an oral presentation or it may be a paper review, and it could be a 3-person panel or a single-person panel, depending on the issue. Witnesses may be brought. New documentation, as I stated earlier, new information is discouraged. However, you can bring that, because it's always better for the new information to go back to the original decision maker, because if that information changes the decision, then you might not need to go through the appeals process. So now I'm going to just clue up with giving you some numbers, I guess, and some current stats. So the average assessment rates in province, Nova Scotia has the highest average assessment rate in the country. The assessments have been steady since around 2015. So even though all the rates are not out yet in all the provinces for 2021, it still does look like Nova Scotia will continue to have the highest average assessment rate in the country. Composite duration. So when you look at duration, duration is how long a claim lasts. It's one of the single most important indicators of the health of the workers' compensation system, and also from a cost driver perspective. So duration is how long a worker is on claim. So if you look at Nova Scotia, and this is a composite duration. Composite means is a 5-year rolling window. It's really hard to measure duration when you look at just 1 year, because a claim doesn't stop at December 31st. You know, a claim can roll over into 2 years or 3 years or whatever the case might be. So that's why the Association of Workers' Comp Boards of Canada uses a 5-year window. So it's called a composite duration to give you a better snapshot of how you're doing as a province with regards to the average number of days a worker is off. So as you can see in Nova Scotia, it's been climbing. In 2014, 102, 2015, 107, 2016, 110, 2017, 117. Then there was a big jump from 2017 to 2018 with 9 days. And now it's actually jumped by 20 days. I think this is the single most highest jump I've seen in a workers' compensation system from a duration perspective. So this is a critical issue right now. We need to get this under control in Nova Scotia. Duration climbing this high would make the system challenging to sustain from a cost perspective, and it's already, you have the highest average assessment rates in the country, and with the duration climbing like this, this is definitely an indicator that something needs to change within the workers' compensation system because the cost is going to be very prohibitive for employers and it's going to cause problems. So clearly employers, the workers' compensation system, medical providers, everybody needs to dig into this and find out what's happening for the duration to be increasing by 20 days in 1 year. It's by far the highest duration in the country right now. All the stats are not in for all the provinces, but a 20-day jump is certainly extremely high. So the things we talked about with return to work and the strategies you need to have in place and what employers' roles are with return to work, it's something that everybody should be taking very seriously in Nova Scotia right now. I mean, this is at a critical stage when you see a duration jump this high. So everybody needs to look within their workplace and figure out what they can do to get this going in a different direction. And this is just cross Canada. So this is for 2018. So the 2019, if you look at Nova Scotia, it's now 147. And the stats are not in yet for all the other provinces. It usually takes another couple of months for all the stats to be in. So anyway, this is just something that I think everybody needs to be aware of. It's pretty critical. Extended claim duration will drive costs. It's the single biggest driver of costs. So the longer a worker is off, then the more it's going to cost. So if you don't address duration, then the system is going to cost more for all employers, and you'll continue to see increases. This just gives you the lost time, the average cost per lost time claim. We don't have current stats on this, so I don't know what this is from the Association of Workers' Comp Boards of Canada, and we don't have the 2019 stats. So it did increase from 2017 to 2018, which obviously would, based on the duration. And I mean, if you were a betting person, you would think 2019 increased too, just by the duration, but we don't have those stats yet. So the cost of claims are increasing. So reducing claim duration, streamlining your processes, effectively and proactively managing your claims are what you need to do as employers, trying to learn and understand the system. If anybody wants to reach out and have a discussion, depending on how they're doing, I'm happy to do that. And at the last slide, you know, there's you can make an appointment and have a chat with us, and it's of no cost to you, you know, to see where you are and the kinds of things that you could possibly be doing to help reduce your claims costs. But, you know, when you think about the economy and trying to ensure that, you know, you have industry wanting to come to Nova Scotia, knowing that you have the highest average base rate, and also that the claim duration is increasing, would certainly not be welcome news for any company looking to come to Nova Scotia. So I would implore you to make this, you know, a priority. And think outside the box. You know, we have been doing really creative things with some of our clients, especially clients who have challenging areas for return to work. So for example, the ambulance business is very challenging when you look at trying to find ways for people to do modified duties, because you can't put someone who's not able to do their full job back on an ambulance. You can't have them sit in the ambulance while, you know, other paramedics are responding to an accident. So, you know, we've had to come up with some really creative ways for some of our clients in this industry, and we have been able to do that. So to have people recover while they're at work and contribute in meaningful ways in the community. So, you know, a lot of companies think that, oh, you know, considering our work, it's really hard to accommodate people, or, you know, we don't have the type of industry where we can easily accommodate people. I would challenge you back on that there's always ways to come up with things, and certainly we've been able to be very creative for our clients to give injured employees meaningful work. So as employers, you need to, you know, own the system, ask questions, participate in appeals. Typically, employers do not have a high percentage rate of initiating appeals or participating in the appeal when the worker appeals. So even when a worker appeals, you still have a right to be there at the table, because a decision can get overturned and can have costly implications for you. And if you weren't there, you know, to provide your side of the story or to provide extra information to the either the hearings officer or at the appeals tribunal, then decisions can get overturned that can have costly implications for you. You also need to hold workers' comp accountable, asking questions. They're spending your money, and making sure that, you know, I know from our perspective, you know, we're continuously holding them accountable, you know, challenging as to, you know, various types of medical treatment or diagnostic treatments, or whether or not a worker can participate in a return to work program, or whether or not they can be back in the workplace, or if they're missing appointments, all those kinds of things. You need to be on top of that, because all of those charges are going on your monthly statement. So it's really important to, you know, from an accountability perspective, make sure you're accessing your monthly statements, you're reviewing them, you're making sure the costs are, you know, you're aware of what the costs are, and that you're asking lots of questions. So if you need any help, you know, it won't take an army, but we have one to help lower your workers' comp costs. So if you want to reach out, you know, we're here to help. So you can have a call with me. You can either schedule it in Calendly, or you can reach out to Jillian directly at jillian@dmconsulting.ca, and we're happy to provide any assistance to you. So that's it for the presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions now, if you have any.
Yeah, we have lots of questions here. So I'll start it off. If we are setting up a new account, will we have a surcharge for not having experience, or will we start off at the base rate?
You'll start off at the base rate till you start to have some experience.
Why are Nova Scotia assessment rates the highest in Canada?
Well, I don't think that's a simple answer. I think that that's a, you got to go back in history, and we could probably do a whole day on that. Certainly the duration is not helping. When you have a climbing duration, as you do right now in Nova Scotia, that is going to significantly impact rates. And then when you have an unfunded liability that's been going on for a long time as well, when you're not 100% funded, then that also adds, because every year you got to collect enough money to pay for last year's claims. And then you have a duration that's going up as well. So it's kind of like, a bit of a perfect storm from the perspective of, how workers' compensation is setting the rates. With an increasing duration, claims costs are going up. And then you also got to pay, you don't have enough money in the bank to pay for yesterday's claims. So that, it's a bit of a double whammy for employers in Nova Scotia.
Absolutely. We have a question actually for New Brunswick. In New Brunswick, is it the employer's responsibility to have the employee complete their incident report, or will WorkSafe New Brunswick contact the injured employee to complete it?
So you're responsible to provide the worker with a copy of the report, but you are not responsible to complete it. So the worker, you are responsible to advise the worker to get the report, or you can give them a copy of the report, but that's up to them to complete it.
Can you give some examples of meaningful work that you have found other companies are doing in the community? I worked for a staffing firm, and we are not always able to have our injured employees doing modified duties at our client job sites.
Yeah, so it's tough to give examples. I would probably rather have a chat with you to determine the type of work, to get an understanding of the type of work, and then where we could look to do that. It's not a cookie cutter approach. You can't just say, oh, tell them to go here or there. So it's something that needs to be done and well thought out, so that you're using the skill set of that worker in a meaningful way. To be able to contribute. And you also need to make sure that their doctor is on board with that, or their healthcare provider, as well as workers' compensation.
So we are living in a COVID world. How has this impacted workers' compensation and related to small business owners?
Well, that's a really, that's a question that really would, has so many answers. For example, people working at home. So people who are now working at home are still covered under workers' compensation. So employers need to be mindful of that, from ergonomic setup to whatever it is you're getting them to do at home. If they sustain an injury, they're working and they're still covered under workers' compensation. So you need to be mindful of that. Certainly it's going to have an impact on costs. Especially workers who couldn't continue with treatment just because treatment providers weren't able to operate for many months. So there could be delays on a worker's recovery, and how that's going to look on claims and claims costs. We don't really know that yet. There's no rule book on this. None of us have been through it before. We've also seen less claims. So there's been a reduction in sick leave and workers' compensation claims in some jurisdictions. So that can also have an impact because of, there's less claims. There's also less money being paid to workers' comp. So from an assessment's perspective, it's based on payroll. And if you haven't had the same amount of payroll, then you're not going to be paying workers' comp as much. So there's a lot of factors that are going to come into play with lower workers' comp getting less money, workers not being able to have treatment. So it's too early really to tell, but there are a lot of factors, and certainly it'll have an impact. But how that's all going to play out, it's a little bit too early for us to tell that yet.
So a few more questions there. What is the risk to a small business owner if they do not have workers' compensation coverage, if they are not considered a mandatory industry?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
What is the risk to a small business owner if they do not have workers' compensation coverage, if they are not considered a mandatory industry?
Well, then you open yourself up to be sued. So under the workers' compensation system in Canada, there's no suing. So you can't sue the worker can't sue you. You can't sue the employer if the employer is covered under workers' compensation. So by not having workers' compensation, then you're not protected under the no suing.
Are there discounted rates for charities?
I don't know that. I would have to look that up, and I think it would depend on the charity.
Does workers' compensation cover injury to workers while they are away to work and while returning home from work?
Okay, so travel to and from work is not covered. But if you are required to travel for work, you are covered. So let's just say in a non-COVID world, your employer asked you to go to a conference in Florida, where we're all dreaming of going right now. And while you're there, you're covered 24 hours a day while you're there, participating in the agenda of the conference while you're traveling there and while you're traveling back. But if there's a significant deviation, so let's just say while you're there, not in the conference agenda, but you decide you always wanted to do skydiving, and you get injured while you're there, because that's a deviation from the conference agenda or the activities, then you could possibly be on your own from that perspective. But anything within the conference agenda, or while you're there, or while you're studying, learning, travel to, from, while you're in the hotel, you're covered 24 hours a day.
So this is the last question. It is a two-part question, but oh, sorry, we just had another one come in. So two more questions. But if there's anything else that's on anyone's mind, now's the time. So the first question is, can you please repeat the percentage of TURB that is paid out to injured workers? And what is the waiting period in Nova Scotia before an employee is paid TURB?
So it's 2 days in Nova Scotia, 2/5. I think it's 2 days, 16 hours or something like that. It's 75% for 26 weeks, and then 85% of the net after 26 weeks. That's my understanding.
Correct. And last question I see here is, office-based workers are usually not exposed to the kind of injuries listed in these slides. Are there situations where such workers need workers' compensation benefits?
Say that again. Are there such cases?
Are there situations where such workers would need workers' compensation benefits?
Where people who work in an office?
Yeah.
I mean, call centers have lots of workers' compensation claims. Either it could be carpal tunnel, it could be prolonged sitting, it could be a bad ergonomic setup, it could be overreaching at your desk, you could fall, your chair, you could slip. I mean, no industry is immune from having incidents and accidents from the perspective of workers' compensation. And as I stated earlier, it's an industrial classification. So just as an example, an oil rig platform has to have an office on land. So everybody pays the same industry, no matter if you've never been on an oil rig or a fish plant. If if they have a head office in the city and the fish plants are out in rural locations, everybody pays the same industrial classification. So even though people from the office might never step foot in a fish plant, it's an industrial classification. So it's based on industry.
Perfect. That's all the questions that I see there. If anything comes to anyone's mind after the presentation, feel free to email me. My email is at the end of the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer those for you.
Okay, that's great. Yep. So as she said, we're just about out of time. So thank you so much, Dallas. That was fabulous. I learned a whole lot today, so I have a lot to follow up on after this. Tomorrow we are hosting a Chamber 101. It's a refresher on your chamber membership. It's free to attend. There's still spots available if you want to register online. This Thursday, we are hosting the very first Nova Scotia Liberal Party candidates debate. So you can meet your next premier. The event will be live streamed for free on our Facebook page. That's this Thursday. And next week on November 26th, we're hosting another free and virtual event called the Road to Recovery Summit. We'll be discussing what's next for our organizations in our region as we navigate the pandemic. We have a great lineup of speakers, including local business owners, economists, and national speakers attending. So please head to halifaxchamber.com/events to see our full lineup and get yourself registered for these great free events. This webinar was recorded as per usual and will be available to all attendees this week on our YouTube channel. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. We'll see you next time. Bye.